Have you ever wondered why people with problems are drawn to you? Why your heart feels like a magnet for toxic relationships and friends who only appear when they need something? If this question has touched you, then Carl Jung has a revelation that can change your life. Jung discovered a unique type of people he had studied for many years: empaths. But here is the shocking truth. Your heightened sensitivity is not a spiritual blessing as you thought. In fact, this is the result of a deep psychological trauma that shaped your personality since childhood. At the end of this video, I will explain why you are programmed to be a savior and how this programming secretly undermines your happiness. I will also present the revolutionary 90-day protocol developed by Jung, which will help you break the invisible chains that have governed your life for years. Prepare to discover a truth you may not have suspected. This journey will not be easy and will challenge everything you believe about love and relationships. But in the end, you will understand how to love deeply without losing yourself. If you are reading this, it is not a coincidence. Your soul is ready for awakening. Have you ever wondered why you are surrounded by broken people? Why does your heart attract lost souls, toxic relationships, and friends who only appear in difficult times? If this question concerns you, Carl Gustav Jung is ready to share something revolutionary about your deep nature. He discovered a special type of people whom he studied carefully throughout his career, calling them bearers of foreign light. These are people who, unknowingly, become bearers of shadows that others cannot endure. But here is a truth that can change your life forever. At the end of this video, I will explain why your unusual empathy is not a divine blessing, but possibly a result of deep psychological trauma that has shaped your personality since childhood. In his office, Jung noticed something unusual. Children raised in conditions where they had to constantly decipher the emotions of adults for survival had developed what he called psychic antennas. Imagine a 6-year-old child who understands that their physical and emotional safety entirely depends on their mother's mood, their father's calmness, and their siblings' behavior. This child develops a superhuman sensitivity to the emotional signals of those around them. But at what cost? The young man realized that such children become the emotional thermostats of their families, constantly regulating their inner temperature to maintain harmony in their environment. If their mother is sad, they become clowns. If their father is angry, they try to be invisible. If someone suffers, they absorb that pain as if it were their personal duty to heal it. However, Jung made a stunning discovery. These children never realize who they truly are unless they learn to manage the emotions of those around them. A Swiss psychiatrist documented astonishing cases of adults who came to him for consultation, completely lost in their identity. They knew how to help others feel better, but had no idea what brought them happiness. They captured the needs of the people around them with surgical precision, but were completely detached from their own desires. Jung noticed that such people developed what he called a hypertrophied false self, a mask. This mask was so convincing that they forgot who they really were. But here, Jung's discovery becomes truly shocking. He noticed that these empaths attract troubled people not by chance. An unconscious mechanism is at work. Jung revealed that the unconscious empath emits a special frequency that silently screams, "I can bear your pain. I can be strong while you are weak. I can become your savior." People with unhealed wounds instinctively sense this frequency, like animals detecting water in the desert. Jung documented that this creates a destructive, vicious cycle. The empath feels alive only when he is needed. The world scares him because he confronts the terrible emptiness that occupies his true self. Healthy relationships seem boring to him as they do not satisfy his distorted need to be irreplaceable. He becomes dependent on dysfunctional relationships because they confirm his distorted self-perception. Jung noticed something even more alarming. These empaths often develop a hidden arrogance. Behind the mask of humility and self-sacrifice lies an unconscious belief in one's superiority. I am special because I can endure what others cannot. They consider themselves more evolved, feeling deeper, more spiritual, because they are ready to love unconditionally. However, Jung understood that this feeling of spiritual superiority was actually a defense against acknowledging his unresolved childhood wound. The psychiatrist noted that these people live in a state he called negative ego inflation. They simultaneously feel both superior and humiliated, special and unnoticed, strong and utterly powerless. This psychological contradiction creates a constant anxiety, as if they exist in two opposing realities at once. The young man discovered that empaths develop toxic symbiotic relationships with those they help. They need these people to remain broken, otherwise they won't feel needed. Secretly, they despise them for their inability to heal. This contempt, unacceptable for their image as a good person, is pushed into the unconscious, where it wanders and turns into chronic resentment. The empath becomes a delayed action emotional bomb, accumulating decades of suppressed anger against those they served with apparent love. However, Jung's most revolutionary discovery about empaths concerns their family environment. He noticed that most of these people grew up in conditions where they had to take on the role of their parents, emotionally caring for adults who were not mature. They learned that love implies complete self-sacrifice and that relationships only function when you give everything without expecting anything in return. Their sole role in life became the desire to be useful to others. The young man noted that this leads to destructive unconscious programming. Empaths quickly attract people who reflect the dynamics of their parental family. For example, if they cared for a mother suffering from depression, they will attract partners with similar issues. If they bore the responsibility for their alcoholic father, they would encounter people with addictions, as if their subconscious was constantly trying to heal the original trauma through symbolic substitutes. The psychiatrist noted that this programming is so deep that empaths often feel repulsion towards emotionally healthy people, perceiving them as boring, superficial, or lifeless. In fact, Jung realized that empaths tend to associate drama with love, chaos with intimacy, and need with self-respect. Calm relationships evoke fear of abandonment in them, as they do not affirm their usefulness. Then Jung made an observation that completely changed our understanding of pathological empathy. He realized that many empaths secretly take pride in their ability to suffer. They develop what he called the complex of the illuminated martyr, an identity based on the ability to endure emotional pain. The more they suffer for others, the more unique they feel. It is a distorted form of narcissism, veiled as virtue. But Jung discovered something even more shocking about these people. They often unconsciously sabotage the healing process of those they help. Why? Because if these people truly recover, the empath will lose their function, identity, and meaning in life. Therefore, they offer help only to alleviate their own guilt, but not enough for real change. It is a subconscious way to keep people dependent on their kindness. The young man noticed that this creates one of the most tormenting internal conflicts a person can experience. An empath sincerely wants to help others, but subconsciously needs them to remain broken. This internal contradiction causes a deep sense of guilt, which the empath tries to alleviate by providing even more help, creating a vicious cycle that can last for decades. The psychiatrist documented cases where empaths visiting him complained of a constant feeling of emptiness, as if they were living someone else's life. They felt like actors playing roles they never consciously chose. The young man realized that the reason for this lay in the fact that the true selves of these people were so deeply buried in childhood experiences that they had practically forgotten who they were, hiding behind the mask of their protector. But it is in this that Jung's true wisdom manifests, bringing liberation. He noticed that in the life of every empath, there comes an inevitable moment when this artificially created structure completely collapses. This moment he called the death of the savior, when the realization comes that you have lived your whole life in an illusion, sacrificing yourself for people who never needed you as much as you wanted them to need you. Jung understood that this awakening does not come easily. It usually arises after a devastating betrayal or such deep emotional exhaustion that you can no longer wear a mask. This terrible realization that your entire identity was built on unhealed wounds. However, Jung knew that this discovery was the first step towards true freedom. What if I tell you that Carl Jung described the exact process by which an empath can escape their psychological prison and finally realize who they truly are when they are not saving anyone? He not only revealed the mechanism of this programming formation, but also the ways of its complete transformation. In the next part, we will delve into Jung's most significant observations about the psychological mechanisms that trap empaths and why awareness of this pattern is the first step to breaking the invisible chains that may have governed your life for decades. The young man was in his office in Zurich when a woman, around 40 years old, came to him and spoke words that forever changed the perception of empaths. Dr. Jung, I have saved so many people that I completely forgot how to save myself. At that moment, the psychiatrist noticed something remarkable. Her eyes sparkled when she spoke about helping others, but became empty when the conversation turned to herself. It was then that Jung realized he was facing a complex psychological mechanism he had not suspected. He began to identify a certain pattern that he called the compulsive savior complex. He noticed that such people do not just help others, they need to do it to feel alive. It resembles a psychological dependency. When they do not solve others' problems, when they are not useful, when they are not needed, they plunge into a deep existential crisis. The young man realized that it was not kindness, but emotional dependence disguised as virtue. Imagine your own life for a moment. How many times have you felt more inspired when a friend called you in tears than when they called to share a joyful event? How many times have you felt a closer connection with someone in moments of crisis than in calm days? Jung discovered that empaths develop a neurological link between drama and intimacy, between need and love. Their subconscious begins to interpret peaceful relationships as signs of rejection. Jung described a case of a man who consistently attracted women with serious emotional problems. For many years, he believed he was just unlucky in love, but after a deep analysis, Jung discovered something remarkable. This man unconsciously rejected emotionally healthy women, as they did not activate his inner program of needs. He was only interested in those he needed to save, as it confirmed his value as a person. The psychiatrist noticed that this situation creates a distorted dynamic. The man becomes similar to the doctor, who needs sick patients to feel his competence. Unconsciously, he sabotages the recovery process of those he helps, because if they truly heal, he will lose his role. Jung noticed that many such people offer just enough support to alleviate feelings of guilt, but never do enough to achieve real change. Then Jung made a discovery that shook his own beliefs. He realized that such personalities often develop a subtle form of emotional sadism. They secretly enjoy watching the suffering of others, as it allows them to feel more important, useful, and irreplaceable. Of course, this satisfaction occurs at an unconscious level, and realizing this would be terrible for their consciousness. However, Jung noticed that such people emit a special energy when helping someone in crisis. This energy feeds their ego rather than contributes to healing. Remember someone you know who always has a dramatic story, who constantly needs to resolve a crisis and requires your help. Notice your feelings when this person finally solves their problems and no longer needs you. The young man discovered that most of these people feel a strange emptiness and even a slight resentment when their beloved victims heal. It's like losing a source of life energy. The psychiatrist noticed something even more troubling. These individuals develop what he called a radar for open wounds. They can instantly identify the emotional vulnerabilities of those around them. But what Jung found most shocking is that they do this not to help, but to find their next project. It is a hunting instinct disguised as compassion. The young man documented astonishing instances where such individuals completely change their identities depending on their surroundings. Working with depressed people, they became motivational therapists. With those experiencing anxiety, they transformed into gurus, calming others. Surrounded by the angry, they took on the role of peacemakers. Jung came to understand that these people had no fixed identity. They were like emotional chameleons, adapting to the needs of others to maintain their significance. But Jung made an observation that changed everything. He realized that behind this mask of adaptability hides a frightened child who learned in childhood that his survival depended on his usefulness. The inner child continues to live in the sensitive adult who constantly experiences fear. He fears that if he stops helping others, he will be left alone. Therefore, such a person cannot refuse, is unable to set boundaries, and cannot simply be at peace without playing a role in the lives of those around him. The young man noticed that it creates one of the harshest ironies of human existence. The more he sacrifices himself for others, the more he loses connection with himself. He is familiar with the dreams, fears, hopes, and traumas of those around him, but lives in complete alienation from his inner life. It feels like you are the director of a film, forgetting that you are playing the lead role yourself. The psychiatrist noted that sensitive people may develop a unique form of depression, which he called the depression of the lost self. It is not just sadness about what has happened, but an existential fear of realizing that you do not know who you are when someone cares about you. It is the understanding that your entire personality is merely a reaction to the needs of others. They are not true manifestations of who you really are. A young man described a case of a nurse who cared for patients and colleagues for 30 years, and upon retiring, faced a deep psychological crisis. She didn't know what to do when there was no one to care for. The young woman realized that she had become so accustomed to the need to be needed that retirement felt to her like social death. Her identity was inextricably linked to the role of a caring caregiver. The psychiatrist noted that this happens because sensitive people develop what he called true amnesia of self. By focusing on the needs of others for decades, they literally forget their own needs, desires, dreams, and ambitions. It feels like living someone else's life for so long that you completely lose touch with your own. Then Jung made an important discovery about the workings of the empathic unconscious. He noticed that such people develop a special form of psychological projection. They project onto others the parts of themselves that were suppressed in childhood. Each wounded person they attract is a reflection of aspects of their own psyche, rejected or deemed unacceptable. If you are constantly surrounded by insecure people, Jung would say that you are projecting your suppressed insecurity. If you encounter anger, it means your own anger is repressed in the unconscious. If you attract dependent people, it means your need for dependency was deemed unacceptable in your family. The empath becomes a walking reflection of their own unhealed wounds. Jung understood that this creates a destructive cycle. The more an empath is inclined to these external projections, the more they avoid facing their inner traumas. It's easier to be a therapist for others than a patient for oneself. It's much more comfortable to focus on the problems of those around than to confront the frightening emptiness in one's soul. The psychiatrist made another striking discovery. Many empaths secretly despise those they help, feeling unconscious anger towards these weak individuals who cannot care for themselves. However, this anger completely contradicts the image that empaths create of themselves as kind and compassionate individuals. Therefore, it is pushed into the subconscious, where it wanders and turns into chronic resentment. Carl Jung confirmed that suppressed anger eventually manifests in unexpected ways. An empath may suddenly feel irrational bursts of irritability, develop psychosomatic disorders, or simply become emotionally indifferent. This is the psychological punishment for years of suppressed emotions. But the most troubling discovery of the empath was that they often unconsciously choose people who can never truly heal. Why does this happen? Because if these people actually find healing, the empaths will be left without purpose. Therefore, they reach out to people with chronic difficulties, deep dependencies, or wounds so old that real healing seems unlikely. Jung noted that this is not a conscious choice, but an unconscious mechanism of self-preservation. Empaths need broken people to maintain their self. This toxic psychological symbiosis prevents anyone from truly growing or healing, yet everyone feels needed and important. What if I told you that Jung found a way to break this vicious cycle? He described the process through which an empath can finally stop living someone else's life and start living their own. In the next section, I will discuss Jung's most shocking discovery about empaths. Why do they secretly destroy their own happiness? And how is this connected to the deepest subconscious feeling of guilt that shapes all their relationships with love and intimacy? Jung analyzed the dreams of an empathic patient when he stumbled upon something that had been troubling him for several weeks. The man constantly dreamed that hungry children were chasing him, crying, "Why didn't you save us?" Jung realized that this dream revealed the darkest truth about the psyche of an empath, a primitive, unconscious sense of guilt, acting as an internal saboteur, destroying any attempts to find personal happiness. This feeling of guilt is not tied to specific actions of the empath. It is much deeper and more destructive. Jung discovered that this feeling is connected to the fact that he survived emotionally while other members of his family remained broken. It is the fault of having developed defense mechanisms while siblings, parents, or other loved ones continued to suffer. The empath subconsciously believes he does not deserve happiness while those around him are suffering. But it is here that Jung's discovery becomes truly shocking. He realized that this feeling of guilt is formed in childhood through subtle but destructive messages. When a sensitive child experiences joy, demonstrates creativity, or expresses themselves, they often perceive it as a signal that they are selfish, as other family members may be suffering. The child begins to understand that their happiness feels like a betrayal to those going through tough times. Have you ever noticed how hard it is to enjoy your achievements when a loved one is facing problems? Have you ever caught yourself downplaying your successes or feeling a strange sense of guilt when things are going well? Carl Jung noted that this is not humility, but an unconscious self-sabotage mechanism that prevents you from truly enjoying life. The young man described a case of a woman who, as she approached important achievements, a promotion, strong relationships, or personal success, undermined them through seemingly rational means. She created conflicts, made self-destructive decisions, or simply backed out at the last moment. During psychoanalysis, Jung discovered that she had an unconscious belief. Success would make her like those who had hurt her in childhood. The psychiatrist noted that sensitive people develop what he called an allergy to happiness. They literally feel uncomfortable when everything goes well because they have been conditioned to associate the world with danger, success with loneliness, and happiness with selfishness, as if their nervous system is tuned to drama and panic even in a state of calm. Jung noticed something even more alarming. Empaths often feel more genuine in suffering than in joy. Their essence is so intertwined with suffering that true moments of happiness seem false, superficial, or fleeting. They seem to be aware of themselves only when carrying an emotional burden. Why does this happen? Jung noticed that in childhood, these people received real attention only when something went wrong. They were ignored when they were happy, and only suffering made them noticeable. This childlike unconscious establishes a fatal connection. Suffering equals love, misfortune equals significance, pain equals value. Jung noted that this creates one of the most cruel paradoxes of human existence. Empaths become dependent on the suffering they strive to avoid in others, developing masochistic relationships with emotional pain, where suffering becomes a habitual way of existence. Being happy turns out to be scarier than being unhappy, as unhappiness is known, predictable, and controllable. Have you ever noticed how easy it is to solve other people's problems, but when it comes to your own, there is always a reason to postpone it? The young man realized that solving his own problems meant making room for happiness, but this happiness brought an unconscious feeling of guilt that could be unbearable. The psychiatrist noted that empaths develop a specific type of self-sabotage, which he called the imposter syndrome, striving for happiness. On a subconscious level, they are convinced that they do not deserve happiness, consider it temporary, and fear that something terrible will happen if they allow themselves to relax and enjoy life. It resembles coexisting with an inner saboteur that destroys all positivity encountered along the way. Jung emphasized that this mindset is so deep that many empaths unconsciously choose partners who contribute to their ongoing suffering. They are attracted to emotionally unavailable, dependent, violent, or simply incompatible people, as such relationships keep empaths in their usual state of pain and victimhood. Healthy relationships activate an internal alarm system that warns, "This is dangerous. You don't deserve this. Something is wrong here." Then Jung made a discovery that changed his understanding of intergenerational trauma. He realized that many empaths carry not only their own wounds, but also the unhealed traumas of their ancestors, as if the family unconsciously chose them to bear the collective pain that no one else could handle. The psychiatrist observed remarkable cases where empaths reported feelings of sadness or responsibility that made no sense in their own lives but perfectly matched the experiences of their parents, grandparents, or even great-grandparents. Jung realized that these people had become psychological repositories of unresolved emotions for their families. But the most troubling part of Jung's discovery was that empaths often choose to carry this pain, as it is the only way to stay connected to their family. If they did not bear the suffering of their family, they would feel completely detached from the world, emotionally orphaned. Pain becomes the thread that binds them to their loved ones. The young man documented that this explains why so many empaths feel guilt when they start to heal. Healing implies individualization, and individualization can be perceived as betrayal for a psyche programmed for collective suffering. They seem to have made an unconscious pact. "I carry the pain so that you do not feel alone in it." The psychiatrist noticed that empaths have an unconscious resistance to therapy or any real healing process, not because they do not wish to recover, but because recovery means breaking the invisible loyalty they maintain in dysfunctional family systems. It is much safer to continue suffering than to risk being abandoned, which could threaten their emotional well-being. Jung came to an even deeper understanding. Empaths often destroy healthy relationships, as such connections reveal the contrast between how they were treated in the past and how they deserve to be treated in the present. It is painful to realize that for many years, they endured emotional suffering instead of enjoying genuine love. However, Jung noticed that on the life path of every empath, there comes a moment when this self-destructive behavior becomes unbearable. He called this moment oversaturation with suffering, when the psyche can no longer endure its own denial. It is at this time that the empath begins to realize that his devotion to suffering has saved no one, healed no one, and has only led to the destruction of his own life. What if I tell you that Jung accurately described what happens at this critical moment? He revealed how the empath's psyche restructures when realizing it has been programmed for failure. In the next part, I will discuss Jung's important discovery, how an empath can break the unconscious contract with suffering and begin to live the life they have always deserved but never allowed themselves. In his practice, Jung described a case that forever changed our understanding of the empath's awakening process. A 35-year-old patient approached him after what she described as a complete emotional breakdown. For 16 years, she had cared for her alcoholic husband and 3 troubled children, completely sacrificing her dreams and needs. But on that day, when her husband came home drunk again and demanded her departure, something inside her simply broke. The young man noticed that she did not scream, cry, or throw a tantrum. Instead, she looked at her husband with terrifying calmness and said, "I can't do this anymore." At that moment, Jung realized something revolutionary about the nature of empathic awakening. It is not a gradual process of awareness, but a sharp, irreversible break from the former identity. The psychiatrist noted that such awakenings occur when an empath reaches what he called the existential limit, a point where continuing the previous model of life becomes absolutely impossible. The psyche, like an emergency system, says, either you change now or you emotionally die. Jung noted that this limit is usually reached after decades of self-sacrifice, when the body and mind can no longer endure constant sacrifices. But what makes this process truly fascinating is that Jung discovered that empathic awakenings are often preceded by so-called symbolic dreams of death. The mentioned patient recounted that several weeks before her breakdown, she repeatedly dreamed that she was buried alive and her acquaintances were covering her coffin with dirt. The young man realized that these dreams symbolize the psychological death of the false empathetic self, preparing the unconscious for a radical transformation. He documented that when the empath finally awakens, he goes through what at first glance may seem like a destructive identity crisis. Suddenly, the people he had supported for many years begin to irritate him. Relationships that seem deep turn out to be superficial and one-sided. The empath surveys the surroundings and realizes that they have built their life based on the needs of others, without any understanding of their own. The psychiatrist noted that this moment evokes both fear and a sense of liberation. The fear arises from the empath losing the identity that has formed over decades. They cease to be aware of who they are when not occupied with saving others. Liberation consists in the fact that for the first time in his adult life, he can make decisions based on his own desires, not the expectations of those around him. Jung made astonishing statistical discoveries. In his study of over 200 empaths who experienced this awakening, 93% reported that the process began between the ages of 35 and 45. He discovered that there is a certain middle age for an empathetic soul when decades of neglect finally start to show. However, here is an unexpected fact recorded by Jung. Awakening empaths often go through a period he called therapeutic rage. This is an emotional outburst directed at those who have taken advantage of their kindness for years. This rage initially frightens the empath, as it contradicts their self-image as a compassionate and understanding person. Jung noted that this anger is actually an important element of healing. He helps the psyche restore emotions suppressed for many years, establish boundaries, and process years of grievances hidden in the unconscious. The psychiatrist discovered that empaths trying to skip the anger phase often revert to old behavior patterns because they have not realized the full depth of the emotional violence experienced. Patient Junga, who had been observed for 3 years after her awakening, shared feelings that he considered typical. "Dr. Jung, I feel as if I have woken up from a long sleep and realized I am living someone else's life. Now I need to figure out who I really am at 35, as if I'm a teenager discovering myself for the first time." Jung noted that empathic awakening goes through certain predictable stages. First comes the rupture, the moment when a person tells themselves, "It will be no more like this." Then comes anger, directed both at those around and at oneself for allowing such a life. This is followed by grief, a deep sadness about lost time and efforts. Finally, curiosity emerges. The first sincere question the empath asks themselves: what do I really want? The psychiatrist noticed something interesting in this last phase. When the awakened empath first asks this question, they often cannot answer it. Decades of focusing solely on the needs of others led to a near-total amnesia regarding one's own preferences, dreams, and true desires, as if a whole part of the personality had frozen in time. The Jung recorded instances where recently awakened empaths had to relearn their basic preferences. What food do they really like? What colors attract them? What activities bring them true pleasure? A patient aged between 1 and 42 shared with Jung, "I always knew my family loved coffee, but only now I realize that I actually hate it and always have. I was just pretending to love coffee because everyone else drank it." The psychiatrist noticed that the awakening of empathy often leads to drastic changes in life that seem quite logical at first glance. Awakened empaths can sever long-standing ties, radically change careers, cut off communication with toxic relatives, or decide on drastic relocations. Jung realized that these changes are not impulsive. This is more of a necessary correction to decisions made over decades that were shaped by the expectations of those around. However, Jung discovered something deeper in the process of awakening. He noticed that newly awakened empaths often go through a stage of therapeutic solitude, during which they consciously avoid close relationships for months or even years. This is not pathological isolation, but a significant period of self-discovery, where they learn to exist without defining themselves through the needs of others. Jung documented that during this phase, many empaths uncover suppressed talents and interests. One patient, for example, discovered a passion for painting at the age of 40. Another, who had focused solely on human relationships for decades, became interested in astronomy. The psychiatrist noticed that the awakened empath often experiences a surge of creative energy that was previously directed solely at solving others' problems. Jung also noted that the awakening of empathy radically changes these people's attitude towards the suffering of those around them. Instead of an automatic urge to help, they develop conscious compassion, allowing them to care for others without sacrificing themselves, losing themselves, or taking on responsibility for the consequences. Jung described a particularly telling case. A newly awakened empath spoke to a friend who had been complaining about the same problems for 5 years. For the first time, instead of giving advice or taking responsibility for resolving the situation, he simply said, "That must be very hard for you," and changed the subject. The friend felt noticeably uncomfortable, as his usual source of emotional support had dried up. Jung noted that this shift often leads to what he called an automatic cleansing of relationships. People who previously interacted with the empath solely for emotional support begin to naturally distance themselves when they realize the empath can no longer fulfill that role. The young man realized that at first this process might cause pain, but it is crucial for revealing true reciprocity in relationships. The psychiatrist made an astonishing statistical discovery. Empaths who had completed the awakening process reported a significantly higher level of life satisfaction compared to the general population, even though they often had fewer connections than before. The young man concluded that the quality of relationships significantly improves when a person stops accepting emotional scraps and starts demanding genuine exchange. However, he noticed that the awakening of empathy is not a one-time process. Empaths who have awakened must remain vigilant not to revert to old patterns of behavior, especially in moments of stress or vulnerability. It resembles learning a new emotional language that requires constant practice for fluency. The Jung documentarily confirmed that fully individualized empaths develop the most mature form of human love. They love consciously, not under the pressure of neurotic impulses. Their desire to help comes from inner abundance, not from emptiness that needs to be filled. This is the difference between mature love and emotional dependence disguised as virtue. But what if I told you that Jung described in detail how to consciously and purposefully make this transition without waiting for an emotional breakdown? He developed special techniques to help empaths reclaim their true essence before decades of self-sacrifice lead to complete burnout. In the next part, I will share Jung's revolutionary method designed to transform unconscious empaths into truly free individuals and explain why this process can become the most important journey of your life. The young man worked with an empathic patient for 2 years when she asked a question that fundamentally changed his approach to treatment. She asked, Dr. Jung, I understand everything you explain about my behavior patterns, but how can I get rid of the guilt if I don't help the suffering person? At that moment, Jung realized that understanding psychological mechanisms alone was not enough. He needed to create practical tools to break decades of unconscious conditioning. Thus, he developed the so-called protocol of empathic individuation, a systematic method helping such people restore their true identity, avoiding the trauma of complete emotional collapse. The first step of this protocol was what he called empathetic mapping of shadows. Patients were asked to compile a list of all the emotions they deemed unacceptable in themselves, but readily forgave in others. The psychiatrist discovered that every empath has an unconscious list of forbidden emotions, including anger, selfishness, laziness, indifference, and coldness. The young man realized that these people had projected their rejected traits onto others throughout their lives, just to avoid confronting the very characteristics that actually belong to their suppressed psyche. They seemed to become therapists of their own aspects that they could not accept directly. Jung recorded one specific exercise that yielded remarkable results. He suggested that the empaths write a detailed letter to each person they had helped over the past 5 years, expressing all their accumulated anger, disappointment, and resentment. The rules were strict. These letters were not to be sent, but written with complete emotional sincerity. What happened during this process surprised even Jung. Most empaths found themselves feeling more anger than love towards those they were trying to save. Decades of suppressed resentment erupted, frightening, yet liberating. One of the patients wrote 23 pages to her ex-husband, an alcoholic, starting with the phrase, "I hate you for taking 15 years of my life while I pretended to help you out of love." The young man noticed that this cathartic process of writing caused a real neurological shift. Empathy finally allowed him to process emotions he had suppressed for decades, enabling his nervous system to reorganize around a more authentic identity. He realized that much of his compassion was actually masked anger. Anger at himself for allowing violence, anger at others for taking advantage of the situation, and anger at the unbearable circumstances. The second stage of Jung's protocol involved experiments with therapeutic selfishness. He suggested that empaths perform one completely selfish act each day for 30 days, starting with small steps and gradually increasing in scale. On the first day, it could be a simple decision about where to have dinner with friends. On the 10th day, it was a refusal to ask for help. And on the 20th day, it was buying something expensive for oneself without needing to explain one's actions to others. The young man noticed that at first these experiments caused great anxiety, but over time, an astonishing truth emerged. The world did not collapse when the empath prioritized his own needs. Moreover, he noticed that people often showed more respect to empaths when they set clear boundaries than when they tirelessly sacrificed themselves. One of the patients shared a revelation that became typical in this practice. "Dr. Jung, for 30 years I thought my friends came to me because I was a good advisor. But when I stopped giving unsolicited advice, I saw that they continued to come to me. Only now do they want to discuss interesting things, rather than just dumping their problems on me." The third component of Jung's method was what he called the reconstruction of personal curiosity. He noticed that empaths lose touch with their own interests, dreams, and natural curiosity. The young man created an exercise where patients were asked to recall all their hobbies before the age of 10, before their empathetic attitudes formed. He noticed that this task often brought to the surface talents and interests long forgotten. One of the patients recalled his passion for astronomy and ultimately returned to university at the age of 45 to study physics. Another remembered his love for cooking and after many years as a social worker, opened his own restaurant. The psychiatrist noticed that reconnecting with these primary passions awakens a life energy that had been dormant for many years. The empath seemed to restore those parts of his soul that had been sacrificed for the care of others. The young man realized that this connection with true interests is essential for forming a personality independent of the needs of others. The fourth element of Jung's protocol turned out to be the most difficult, what he called a therapeutic fast in relationships. He instructed the empaths not to offer unsolicited emotional help for at least 3 months. If someone shared their problem, the response had to be brief. After that, they should change the subject or simply remain silent with sympathy. The young man noticed that such a post helps to understand which relationships are truly mutual and which are based solely on the dynamics of dependency on a caretaker. Many friendships faded when the empath stopped playing the role of a free therapist. At first, it was painful, but Jung discovered that such practice opens up space for more sincere and balanced relationships. One patient described this experience as profoundly revealing, stating that he discovered that half the people in his life were merely ghosts, existing only through his energy. When he stopped feeding them, they simply disappeared, and he realized that there had never been a real relationship between them. Jung also developed a method known as the empathic mirror technique. Whenever an empath felt the need to help someone, he first asked himself, "What unhealed part of myself do I see in this person?" Jung noted that this simple question helps uncover the unconscious projections that keep empaths in a cycle of rescue. If an empath felt the need to support someone suffering from depression, Jung urged them to explore their own suppressed depression. If he felt the need to save a person experiencing financial difficulties, he should analyze his own fears about material well-being. Jung understood that every sacrifice made by the empath reflected his unresolved personal trauma. The psychiatrist noted that this technique allowed for a deeper understanding of the true nature of the empathic state. It was not selfless love, but an unconscious form of self-therapy. When the empath tried to heal his inner wounds with symbolic substitutes, it was much easier for him to help another person cope with depression than to confront his own suppressed emotions. Carl Jung also proposed a practice he considered extremely important: the keeping of an anger journal. Every empath participating in his method had to write down everything that irritated, upset, or troubled them every morning for 10 minutes, even the smallest details. The young man noticed that empaths had completely lost touch with their natural anger, perceiving it as a negative feeling to be suppressed. However, Jung understood that anger is a natural signal of the psyche indicating boundary violations and unmet needs rather than relationship problems. Empaths, reconnecting with their true anger, learned to set healthy boundaries before situations became unbearable. One of the most revolutionary aspects of Jung's method was what he called the practice of compassionate indifference. He taught empaths to develop what seemed to be a contradictory attitude: to care for the well-being of others while remaining completely indifferent to the consequences of their choices. This meant to love without taking responsibility for their actions, to care without sacrificing oneself. The young man discovered that this approach is key to healthy relationships. When the empath stopped trying to control others' lives with his interference, surprisingly, those around him began to take more responsibility for their own lives. It seemed that the empath's obsessive desire to help was actually hindering the natural development of others. One of the patients summarized this transformation with words that Jung considered completely accurate. "Dr. Jung, I realized that what I called love was actually veiled control. Now I can love people enough to let them live their lives, even if it means watching them make mistakes I could have helped them avoid." The young man noticed that the empaths who underwent his individuation protocol reported a feeling that most of them had never experienced in adulthood: a genuine inner peace. It was not a fleeting comfort arising from solving someone else's problem, but a deep tranquility, completely independent of external circumstances or the needs of others. What if I tell you that Jung discovered something even more astonishing about empaths who have undergone this individuation process? He documented a transformation that not only liberates a person, but also triggers a chain reaction, altering all relationships around him. In the final part, I will talk about Jung's most remarkable discovery: how a truly individualized empath becomes a catalyst for collective healing, but in a completely different way than before. In the last years of his life, Carl Jung recorded in his personal diary thoughts he considered among the most significant of his career. He noted that when an empath undergoes the process of individuation, they do not lose the ability to love deeply. On the contrary, they learn to love while preserving their individuality. This change not only benefits him, but also elevates the level of human qualities in those around him. Jung discovered that the empaths who completed the process of individuation become what he called catalysts of authenticity. Their presence inspires others to be more genuine with themselves, to bravely set boundaries, and to better cope with their own wounds instead of projecting them onto others. It is as if their liberation creates a wave that allows others to free themselves as well. However, Jung realized something deeper. Individualized empaths developed a form of compassion that was both more powerful and less aggressive than anything they had experienced before. They learned to accept people as they are, without an intrusive desire to fix or save. This radical acceptance, paradoxically, created more opportunities for genuine growth than decades of intrusive help. Jung documented astonishing cases where adult children of individualized empaths reported that their parents finally saw them for who they truly were. Husbands and wives described a feeling of freedom in their relationships that they had never experienced before, as if the cessation of imposed care had paved the way for true love. One of Jung's last patients, a woman who completed her individuation at the age of 52, summarized this transformation, which he considered poetic. Dr. Jung, at 50, I thought that to love meant to endure another's pain. Now I understand that to love is to respect another person's ability to endure their pain and through that, find their strength. But Jung understood that intellectual awareness of these principles is only the first step. He knew that the empaths needed a concrete, systematic plan for applying these discoveries in everyday life. Therefore, in the last years of his practice, he developed the so-called 90-day protocol of empathetic transformation, a step-by-step guide to freeing oneself from the invisible chains of emotional codependence. If you have read this text to the end, the words of the Jungian have likely touched something deep in your soul. Perhaps you recognized your own patterns in the description I provided. You may have experienced mixed feelings of relief and horror, realizing that you are not alone on this journey, but you must also confront the truth about yourself that you would prefer to hide. I want you to know that this realization is not accidental. The young man believed that certain information comes to us when our soul is ready for transformation. If these words resonate in your heart, it is time to stop living someone else's life and start living your own. The protocol I want to present to you is not just a theoretical concept. It embodies decades of clinical practice accumulated by Jung and the experiences of many highly sensitive individuals who chose the path of freedom instead of remaining trapped in codependency. However, I must be honest with you. This path is not easy. It will require courage to face those parts of yourself that you may have avoided your entire life. For the first 30 days, you will focus on what Jung called emotional detoxification. During this period, you should maintain a fast in relationships, which means for 30 days you will not provide unsolicited emotional support to anyone. When someone shares their problem with you, it will be difficult to simply respond and then fall into silence or change the subject. I understand that this may seem abrupt, especially if you have been a therapist for your loved ones for many years. However, Jung concluded that such a time limitation is necessary to break the neurotic cycle of need. You need to feel what it is like to exist without regulating the emotions of those around you. You need to understand who you are when you are not playing the role of a savior. During these first 30 days, you will also keep a daily anger journal, as Jung mentioned. Every morning, before doing anything else, you will write for exactly 10 minutes about what irritates, upsets, or worries you. Do not try to control your thoughts or strive for spiritual correctness. Let your anger flow freely onto the paper without judgment. Jung noted that highly sensitive people often become frightened by the volume of anger they feel. Decades of suppressed grievances can suddenly surface. This is normal and even necessary. Your anger is valuable information about violated boundaries, ignored needs, and forgotten aspects of your personality. It is a process of restoring your emotional navigation system. At the same time, you will begin therapeutic experiments with selfishness, which I have already mentioned. Every morning, after writing in the anger journal, you will choose one selfish act to perform during the day. Start with small steps. Choose a movie you want to watch, buy your favorite snack, take your favorite route to work. Gradually increase the level of intensity. Refuse a meeting you don't want to attend. Buy yourself something expensive without justifying your actions. Spend a whole day doing only what you enjoy. In the second 30 days, you will enter a phase that Jung called the reconstruction of true identity. During this period, you will focus on rethinking who you really are when you are not defined by the needs of others. You will perform Jung's exercise dedicated to the archaeology of passion. Find a quiet place and immerse yourself in childhood memories. Recall everything that captivated you before the age of 10, what you did for hours without fatigue, what truly interested you, what did you sincerely dream about. Write all of this down, no matter how absurd or inappropriate it may seem at the moment. Jung concluded that childhood interests contain the seeds of our true purpose. These passions reflect aspects of our soul that existed before we were influenced by social programming, family upbringing, and before we learned that our worth is defined by our usefulness to others. Reconnecting with these passions is a return to one's true essence. During the second month, you will also master what Jung called the technique of the empathic mirror. Every time you feel the urge to help someone, stop and ask yourself, what unhealed part of myself do I see in this person? If you want to save someone who is depressed, explore your own suppressed sadness. If you want to support a person with anxiety, pay attention to your own unresolved fears. Jung realized that every person we strive to save is a reflection of some part of ourselves that needs attention. Instead of projecting your needs onto others, you will learn to work with your own wounds. This is true emotional responsibility, to become a parent to your inner child rather than trying to adopt someone else's. The last 30 days of your experiment will lead you into the most transformative phase, the integration of compassionate self. During this period, you will discover the most mature form of love, a deep love without self-sacrifice, care that does not require self-denial, and attention without the need to be responsible for the outcomes. You will practice compassionate indifference. As I mentioned, this means that you will learn to deeply care for the well-being of others while remaining completely detached from the consequences of their decisions. You will be able to love your child, allowing them to make their own mistakes. You can care for your partner while acknowledging their right to be unhappy if they wish. This is perhaps the most difficult lesson for sensitive people. True love sometimes requires allowing loved ones to experience the natural consequences of their decisions. Jung concluded that by ceasing to protect others from their own experiences, we paradoxically create more space for their growth and strength. Over the next 30 days, you will also practice what Jung called conscious generosity. Instead of acting on an automatic impulse to help, you will learn to consciously choose when, how, and to whom to offer your assistance. You will help because you want to, not because it is necessary. You will give from abundance, not from emptiness. The young man noticed that this shift completely changes the quality of your help. When you help consciously, rather than out of panic, your support becomes truly beneficial rather than unconsciously harmful. People feel the difference between help that comes from abundance and help that comes from need. However, Jung realized that bringing these changes to reality would not be easy. He noticed that empaths often face resistance both from themselves and from those around them who benefit from their codependency. Preparing for this confrontation is crucial for successful transformation. When you start setting boundaries, some people may accuse you of selfishness or insensitivity. If you stop being constantly available to solve others' problems, someone might say that you have changed or that you have become indifferent. The young warned his patients. Such accusations concern not you, but the discomforts that others experience when you stop meeting their expectations. Don't forget, you have spent years, perhaps decades, training those around you to rely on you to bear their emotional burdens. When you stop doing this, they will have to acknowledge that they are responsible for their own emotional states. This may cause them anxiety, anger, or attempts to manipulate you back to old patterns of behavior. Jung noted that empaths who overcome this initial resistance ultimately discover something astonishing. People who sincerely love them adapt to new boundaries and often come to respect them more for having established them. Relationships that did not survive the transformation were based on dependence rather than true love. But perhaps you are wondering, what if I realize that I am incapable of healthy love? What if, after stopping being codependent, I become cold and unfeeling? Jung faced this problem with hundreds of his patients and can assure you that your fears are unfounded. The ability to love deeply does not fade when you become an individual. It is purified. Jung noted that individualized empaths develop a capacity for love that is both more intense and deeper than anything they have experienced before. They love without selfish intentions, care without control, establish connections without losing themselves. This is the difference between mature love and emotional dependency disguised as virtue. One of the most astonishing discoveries of Jung about transformed empaths is that they become unconscious models of authenticity for everyone around. Their presence carries a silent yet powerful message. One can be loved just as they are, without bearing the burdens of others and without sacrificing their soul. Children of individualized empaths grow up with a natural understanding of healthy boundaries. Their partners learn to take responsibility for their emotional experiences. Friends discover inner sources of strength they were previously unaware of. The transformation of the empath creates waves of healing that are passed down through generations. But Jung also discovered something that I find deeply encouraging. Empaths who have completed their journey of individuation often come to realize that their heightened sensitivity is not a curse, but a gift that can now be used for good. They become creators, therapists, spiritual mentors, and activists, channeling their deep feelings into creating beauty, healing, and transforming the world. The main difference is that now they act consciously, not out of neurotic compulsion. They create from a state of abundance, not emptiness. Their service is based on the desire to contribute, not on the need to be needed. This fundamental shift in motivation radically changes the quality of their contribution to the world. In the last years of his life, Carl Jung claimed that the greatest gift an empath can offer is not to bear the pain of others, but to demonstrate that one can feel deeply while remaining whole. This means we can love without losing ourselves, care without sacrificing ourselves, and serve without becoming dependent. I want you to understand, choosing this transformational path is not just a matter of your freedom, though that is extremely important. This is about breaking long-standing codependent patterns that may have existed in your family for decades. It is also about creating a legacy of healthy relationships for your children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. It promotes the development of human consciousness towards more mature forms of love and connection. I understand that my proposed approach may seem difficult, especially if you have defined yourself through your usefulness to others your whole life. But I want you to realize something fundamental. You are not born to be a vessel of others' unresolved emotions. You should not live someone else's life, experiencing someone else's dramas. You have a unique soul, your own gifts, and your own vision of the world. However, as long as you wander in the labyrinth of empathetic codependency, these gifts remain undiscovered. Your true contribution to the world, which only you can offer, is suppressed by layers of unnecessary sacrifices and unreasonable love. Jung believed that every person has what he called an individual task, a unique contribution that only they can make. For empaths, realizing and fulfilling this task requires the courage to stop living through others and start living for themselves. Imagine for a moment what your life could be like if you could love deeply without losing yourself. Imagine waking up every morning knowing exactly who you are, regardless of who needs you that day. Imagine your relationships are built on mutual choice, not desperate need. Imagine contributing to the development of the world using your unique gifts rather than your unhealed wounds. This is not an unattainable dream, it is a natural outcome of the individuation process described by Jung. Hundreds of empaths have walked this path before you. They emerged from it not cold and indifferent, but as whole individuals who finally learned to love, respecting both themselves and others. However, this transformation does not happen by itself. It requires conscious intention, constant practice, and above all, the courage to face those aspects of yourself that you may have avoided for many years. It also implies a willingness to disappoint some people in order to finally stop disappointing yourself. Carl Jung noted that the hardest moment for an empath comes not when others no longer need them, but when they realize they can be loved for who they truly are, not just for what they can offer. This realization of one's true nature, freed from expectations, becomes not only acceptable, but also beautiful. If you have reached this moment, a call to freedom resonates in your soul. Perhaps you have spent years or even decades ignoring this call, but it has not disappeared. He is still here, patiently waiting for you to gather the courage to hear him. Today could be the day you stop waiting for approval from others to live your life. Perhaps this is the day you decide that you deserve relationships based on genuine love rather than hidden needs. Perhaps this is the day you choose to honor the unique gifts you brought into this world instead of hiding them under the weight of unnecessary sacrifices. The program I shared with you is not just a set of exercises. It is your roadmap to freedom. It is the path of the Jungian, transforming the extraordinary sensitivity of an empath from a burden into a gift, opening the way to deeper forms of love and attachment. But I need to clarify one important point. This journey will demand everything from you. It will require rethinking beliefs you may have held for many years. It will take courage to face the fact that some people around you may not like your true self. This will require choosing your own well-being, even if it means disappointing others. The young man understood that not all empaths would choose this path. Some would remain trapped in a gilded prison of dependencies for the rest of their lives, convinced that their self-sacrifice was a virtue and their neglect of self was love. It is a tragedy, but it is a choice that everyone has the right to make. However, if you decide to choose freedom, if you realize it's time to stop living through others and start living for yourself, know that you are not alone on this journey. There is a growing circle of empaths who awaken, learn to love without losing themselves, discover their unique gifts, and contribute to the world, valuing both themselves and others. Your path to individuation will not only transform your life, but also become a beacon of hope for other empaths still wandering in the labyrinth of dependencies. Your freedom will be a silent permission for others to make the same choice. Your healing will be a catalyst for collective healing. This is the legacy Jung left us. The understanding that we can love deeply without losing our individuality, serve the world without becoming its victims, and be sensitive and compassionate without turning into repositories of others' unresolved emotions. We can be whole. If this message resonated in your heart, if you recognized your own patterns in it, do not let this inspiration fade. Start acting today. Tomorrow morning, begin keeping a daily anger journal. For the next 30 days, share your experiences. Take the first step towards your freedom. If you're ready to delve into this journey, if you need further advice on how to implement these changes in your life, let me know in the comments. Share your experiences, questions, and fears. If you prefer to remain anonymous, do so, but be sure to share. Perhaps your story will be the very push that helps another person on the path to freedom. If you liked this message, let me know. Subscribe to receive more materials on depth psychology, individuation, and personal transformation based on the teachings of Carl Jung. Together, we can create a community of people who choose authenticity over codependency, mature love instead of envy, those who dare to contribute to the world using their unique talents rather than their unhealed wounds. Remember Jung's words about empaths? When empaths truly begin to individualize, they do not lose the ability to love. They finally learn how to do it without destroying themselves. This is what I offer you today. Not just to heal, but to reveal your true essence. When you stop living someone else's life and start your own, your soul awaits. The world awaits your unique contribution. The young man, wherever he is, would be proud that his discoveries continue to free souls from their gilded prisons, one by one. The time has come. The choice is yours. Freedom awaits.